قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين، فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء، إنه الإسلام نور وضياء.
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم، ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah and welcome to Finding Me. Today in the ITV Networks, a very special venue here in Pretoria at the Sheraton Hotel. We are guests of AMEC, the Afro-Middle East Center, and the focus of course is on civil society, on the different actors that influence state policy.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I think as I was growing up, a young Jewish girl, very much in a family that took words very seriously. My parents wanted me to be a lawyer. They thought I was always talking back, that I should be a lawyer. And I grew up always willing to speak my mind. Now, for many years, that meant I was a great supporter of Israel. I grew up a very strong Zionist. Broke with that when I went to university in the middle of the Vietnam War, the height of the anti-war movement, and got swept up into that movement as so many people did, and put aside thinking about the Middle East for a very long time. And when something happened that finally put it in front of my face and said, you have to think about this again. I remember thinking by that time, of course, I had been studying imperialism, studying colonialism, and I thought, I think I was wrong about that Israel stuff. And I went to my father's library and read Herzl, the father of modern Zionism, and I saw his links with colonialism, his efforts to get support from Cecil Rhodes. And he wrote in a letter to Rhodes, he said, why am I coming to you with this? Because you're interested in Africa, I'm interested in the same way in a little piece of Arabia. It's because our projects are both something colonial. And I thought, whoa, nobody ever taught me that. So when I saw that, it was like, okay, that's that. I'm done. So, yeah.
But we just think that the peer pressure to get to that.
Exactly.
So the fact that much of this said that you did, today there is many states are directly trying to erase it from the Palestinians to prevent people from engaging in this politics. And it's almost kind of a life loss issue. I'm looking at that is actually one of the things that affects the kind of citizens that we are.
Well, I think it depends where you're talking about. If you're talking about in the United States, the effort is less at the moment on changing curricula. It's more pressuring faculty members and students who are mobilizing, who are active outside of the classroom, supporting the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, BDS, or in general supporting Palestinian rights. And I think there is a sense among those who have a vested interest in maintaining U.S. uncritical support for Israel, maintaining U.S. military aid to Israel, maintaining U.S. protection of Israel at the United Nations. Those forces, the pro-Israel lobbies, and there are many of them, there are Christian ones, there are Jewish ones, there are many, those forces, I think, see a great threat from the changing views of students in the United States. They're more worried about young students growing up with a more independent view of the world, including a more independent view about Israel, than they are worried, for example, about the churches that have played arguably a far more important role in the BDS movement than the student movement. They are sitting on enormous sums of money, which the investments could be affected, where they invest, where they don't invest, based on boycott decisions of the General Assembly that they have taken because of issues of human rights for Palestinians, because of issues of equality for Palestinians. And to me, that should be a greater concern. But their real concern, and I understand this, is that they are potentially losing young people. In the Jewish community, they're worried about losing the assumptions of young Jews growing up the way I did, where The assumption was if you were Jewish, you supported Israel. That's absolutely no longer the case. There are now too many options. There are still these same lobby-based organizations on the right. There's an organization like J Street at the center, and there are a host of organizations on the left, the biggest one being Jewish Voice for Peace, which, of course, has a very powerful appeal to young people. It has chapters in 40-odd cities, many on college campuses, has 250,000 online supporters and about 30,000 members, paid-up members. So it's a huge and growing organization with a lot of young people, a lot of energy, a lot of excitement. And I think they're worried about that.
So, but arguably that would be a significant concern, because this is the future generation that is going to vote, and I think greater number of youth are coming to the polls now to vote. But more importantly is they are going to be the future of the governing, in terms of, if you look at replacing politics and in the way the world is going, I think that the shift is towards more younger people to come into power,
That's right. Young people right now in the U.S., there's a cohort of young people that includes a lot of people of color, mainly women. Some are Muslim, one is Palestinian. It's an amazingly diverse group. Several are gay and lesbian, one is trans. And that diversity of young people running, some are running for Congress, one is running for governor, they're running for all kinds of offices.
Yes.
It's incredibly exciting because they come out of social movements. They come out of the immigrant rights movement, out of the women's movement, out of the environmental justice movement, out of the labor movement. And all of these movements are producing these new leaders. And it's a very exciting moment as a result.
So in spite of the belief that the empire is about to collapse, it might be that there will be a resurgence, but hopefully in terms of a better approach to human rights, international law, ethics and foreign policy.
I'm not sure anyone thinks the empire is about to collapse.
Okay.
We are far from that.
You reckon?
There's still a powerful empire. It has been narrowed. Its potential has been narrowed in certain ways, but it is not anywhere close to collapsing.
Yeah, but the U.S. has proven to be a very unethical actor, especially in terms of international
That's been true
relations.
For many generations.
Yes, for many generations. But the question is, I think, with the rising powers, and if you look at the developing countries, etc., the change in mentalities, the greater education, diversification in terms of knowledge, social media, creating alternate perspectives, awareness, etc. People are no longer willing to just accept the line that's being offered by the U.S., and they're questioning this.
That's absolutely right. It's also true. This is always a very nuanced discussion. There are alternative sources of information out there. There is also, in the U.S. in particular, an increasing level of consolidation of control over media, both social media and traditional media. So fewer and fewer corporations now own the mainstream media. We see that the corporations who own social media is not purely social.
Yes.
They are all, those platforms are owned by corporations whose interest is not in expanding democratic access to information. Their interest is in making a profit. And making a profit based on their model, their algorithms require narrowing what people have access to on an individual basis, not widening it. So we have a lot of work to do.
So people actually think they're free, but they're being curtailed in indirect ways.
It takes a lot of work.
Yeah. So I see here that one of the ways in which AMEC has introduced you is that your focus has been a lot on ending occupation and wars and changing U.S. policy to strengthen international human rights and equality in the Middle East. In my opinion, it can also be read in a very condescending way, because people would say, like, why would the U.S. or U.S. policy want to interfere in how, equality or human rights, etc., is done in the Middle East? Let them figure it out for themselves.
If the U.S. was prepared to simply get out, that would make sense. The U.S. is not prepared to do that. So the question is, what is the basis on which U.S. policy is created? The U.S. is by far not only the most powerful nation that ever existed in history, but the wealthiest ever in history. And that puts a great deal of responsibility on the United States. We have an obligation as members of humanity to provide for people who are poor, countries that are poor, before we even start to talk about the countries that are poorer because we have destroyed them.
Right.
So the obligations that the United States owes to the people of Iraq, to the people of Afghanistan, increasingly to the people of Libya, the people of Syria, the people of so many parts of the world, who we have devastated through our policies over the world, over the years. I'm not proposing that we should become isolationists. We should not. But we should have a policy that is itself grounded on equality, international law, and humanity, rather than...
So a strong ethical foreign policy.
Exactly. Rather than what we currently have, which is a foreign policy based on militarism and building up U.S. economic and military strength. That's the choice. And so it's in that context that I'm not saying what the policies, domestic or foreign, should be for any country in the world other than my own. I'm saying that my country's policy should be grounded in international law, human rights, and equality for all.
Okay, so we have to go to the break. When we come back, I would like you to talk to us a little bit on what you see in terms of your discussion when you started more than 10 years ago about Iraq and where it is today. We'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me today in the ITV networks with a very special guest, and this is Phyllis Bennis from the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington. Before we went on to the break, Phyllis was explaining about the role of the US, well, the role it should adopt in terms of foreign policy and its treatment of other countries. Now, Phyllis, I'm very intrigued because, like I said, the first time I actually encountered your presence was through the television screen, and it was that time when Al Jazeera had just launched and you were doing interviews about Iraq and the proposed invasion into Iraq. Going back all those years and the predictions that you had outlaid, the comments that you made, the warnings that you gave to the US, etc., do you see that much of the things that you said came to fruition and that there was a cost?
Well, unfortunately, yes, all the things that we predicted, our whole movement was predicting this. This was not rocket science.
Yeah.
You didn't need to be a brain surgeon to figure out what was going to happen as a result of this war. And yes, we tried to warn the government, we tried to explain it to the American people, and most people could hear it but not move on it, not act on it, because the propaganda had been so incredibly strong. It was very hard to resist that propaganda that said Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, Iraq is somehow going to be a threat to us. The claim was made that Iraq had something to do with the terrorist attacks of September 11, none of which was true.
It's true, yes.
None of which was true. But what we saw at that time, and I think it may have been when you first saw me on Al Jazeera, thinking back, just before the war was launched, on February 15th of 2003, just about 3 weeks before the war, was what was known as the day the world said no to war.
Yes.
It was a massive day across the world. More than 14 million people flooded the streets of capitals around the world in 660 some odd cities in almost every country in the world, including Antarctica, where people went out in the snow with their wool jackets and formed a peace sign laying down in the snow. It was extraordinary. But it was a moment when I think we believed for a short time it might be possible to stop that war. It very quickly after that day became clear we could not. That they were determined to wage this war despite massive opposition both from the governments and from the people and from the United Nations. This was the first time the United Nations played the role that its charter says it's supposed to play, which is to stop the scourge of war.
Yes.
And you had on the Security Council, you have the 5 permanent members plus 10 rotating members. And at that time, the permanent members were divided. You had the US and Britain on the one hand supporting war, France, China, and Russia saying no to war. You also had Germany on the council saying no. And then you had 6 other countries, what became known as the uncommitted 6. The US rather dismissively called them the six-pack. But these were countries who ordinarily would never have enough power, enough wealth to stand up to the United States one-on-one. But together, while protesters were flooding their capitals, demanding that they say no to the US war, no to Blair and Bush, they said no. And they stood up for those months and refused to allow the Security Council to vote in favor of the war. Those countries were Angola, Cameroon, Guinea, Pakistan, Mexico, Chile.
Wow.
None of those
No,
are
so
powerful
no,
countries,
not
right?
developed either. Yeah.
All of them are countries dependent on U.S. aid, dependent on U.S. trade deals, dependent on all of that. And the U.S. threatened all of it. It told Mexico, you don't vote with us, we're going to cut off negotiations over the border and over immigration. It told Cameroon and Guinea, we are going to cut off all aid and we're going to cut back on your trade benefits. They told Pakistan they were going to cut all military aid. These were important issues for these governments, and yet they stood firm. Some of the diplomats told us privately, we don't know how long we can hold out.
Wow.
We don't know how long our capital will let us keep voting. But they did, until suddenly the U.S. went to war without that permission, knowing that it was illegal.
So I want to ask you, yes, you're saying it's illegal, but still today when I read the literature, there is a dispute as whether it was an illegal invasion or it was a technically legal invasion.
It was not technically legal. In 1991, when the U.S. invaded Iraq the first time, that was technically legal because the U.S. had bribed and threatened members of the Security Council sufficiently so that enough countries agreed to vote for it. Russia was on the verge of collapse because the Soviet Union was collapsing and Russia didn't know what to do. And China was bribed into abstaining rather than vetoing. And as a result, it had the approval of the United Nations. Only Cuba and Yemen voted no. And in that context, that war was technically legal. It was illegitimate, it was immoral, it was an outrage. But it was technically legal. In 2003, it was immoral, it was illegal, and it was immoral, it was
Illegal.
illegitimate, and it was illegal.
Illegal, yeah.
So that's a very important distinction. It becomes clear that most of the rest of the world takes more seriously than Americans do, although some of us are learning, to take seriously international law and United Nations resolutions.
But international law is mostly about soft power. They do not have the potential to really, hold the U.S. to account. I mean, this is what we've seen time and time again. So what is the benefit?
The benefit is twofold. One is issues of legitimacy are very important for diplomacy and for nations. It's the reason that you see Israel defining the BDS movement as a greater threat than Iranian nukes, which of course don't exist.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that, yeah.
But to clarify, there are no Iranian nukes, there never have been. But the official Israeli position from a number of important think tanks there and a number of government officials is that BDS represents a greater threat than Iran's nuclear capacity in the future, Iran's military capacity now. Why? Because it threatens to delegitimize Israel, which of course is absolutely true. Israel is delegitimized by its occupation, by its apartheid policies. All of these things delegitimize the state, and the BDS movement highlights those realities because BDS, of course, is based on specific violations of international law. It says we will boycott Israel until they stop violating these three areas of law. It's not we're going to boycott Israel forever because we hate Israel. It's to stop these three arenas. And when you talk about what are those three areas, you're showing why Israel does not have any real legitimacy in the world because of those policies that it is maintaining. So that becomes a very important reality. International law is very important. It's not yet capable of what we want it to be capable of. But it is far more capable than it used to be. There is something called an International Criminal Court, which has now brought sitting heads of state to justice. Now, has it brought Henry Kissinger to the dock? No. It has brought the representatives of weaker governments. We are not yet at that point when Henry Kissinger will be in the dock with Augusto Pinochet of Chile, who Henry Kissinger gave permission to carry out his atrocities. But we work towards that. History doesn't change in one fell swoop.
No, it doesn't.
We're not storming the Winter Palace and creating the International Criminal Court, but we are changing history, and that's crucial.
So the activism continues in spite of the obstacles.
It has to.
So I have a very personal question. A Jewish woman, raised, with the belief in Israel as the ideal state, indoctrinated in a way by Zionism. You shift your perspective, you become outspoken, you're a campaigner now for BDS, you speak out against the occupation, against the Israeli violations, etc. Personal challenges?
Oh, sure. There's always that. But it's not as bad as it used to be.
Okay. So the tide is turning?
The tide has absolutely turned. The shift in political discourse in the United States is massive. It shows up in the polls, it shows up in public opinion. The shift in the media is huge. It's not as massive as the public shift, but it's very important. People look at it now and say, oh, it's terrible. And it is terrible. But if you compare it to 20 years ago, to 10 years ago, to even 5 years ago, you now have the word Nakba,
Yes.
the catastrophe of the Palestinian displacement that happened with the creation of Israel. 750,000 Palestinians expelled from their homes, never allowed to return. You never heard that word in the mainstream media. Now it's in the New York Times every other week.
But
You
there's
have
always a
Palestinian-
criticism of the New York Times in the way in which they slant the story.
Well, that's true. They still do. Remember I said it's still terrible?
Yeah.
But it is so much better than it used to be.
Okay.
There are Palestinian voices on the op-ed page on a monthly basis. The organizations like the IMEU, the the Institute for Middle East Understanding, whose sole work is to place Palestinian voices in the mainstream media in the United States, started with a struggling couple of people figuring out what they could do. They now can't keep up with requests. They have a staff of more than 20 spread across the whole country.
Well, that's
They're
fantastic.
doing amazing work. This didn't just happen. Some of it, of course, happened because Israeli violations have been worse, and Israeli violations have been more visible through social media, through mainstream media, in all those ways. But it's also true that public opinion changes because organizations are out there working to change it. Jewish
So there
Voice
must
for
be
Peace,
people doing the work. Yeah.
that I mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
is doing amazing work to
Yes.
change the discourse. The U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, which has 300 or 400 member organizations, the big coalition of
Yes.
everybody working on the issue, has mainstream churches and a whole range of people involved across the country. The work that all of these groups have been doing for all of these years has changed the situation.
Let's change the
dramatically.
landscape, yeah.
So that, are there still false claims being made that if you're opposing Israel, you're somehow an
Anti-Semite,
anti-Semite?
yes.
Yes, they are still being made, but not as much as before, and they can't get away with it as much as before.
People are more educated
People
also.
are more educated. I used to get death threats pretty frequently. I don't get them anymore.
Wow,
They
okay.
shot into my house years ago, many years ago. That doesn't happen anymore. It just isn't the way it used to be.
Which reminds me of what one of my friends is a black consciousness individual, radical, so-called radical in the South African context. And a few years ago, when we started to talk about decolonization, and the racialized capitalism, etc., the way in which the South African landscape needed to change, when he used to go out and speak, people used to say, so radical. Today he's mainstream. So you were radical then, and now you're almost mainstream, right?
Almost. Not quite,
Yeah.
but getting there.
Yeah. Okay. So as a final question, because we're at the end, and this is a policy question. From a policy angle and policy studies, would you say that Israel is an apartheid state?
Certainly. Not because it looks just like South Africa. It's completely different than your country. But because its policies specifically violate the terms of the International Covenant Against the Crime of Apartheid. If you look at the definition of apartheid in that covenant, it talks about a single territorial unit in which one government, and here we're talking about Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and occupied Arab Jerusalem, all together are one unit because they are all ultimately under the control
Yes.
of the Israeli government and the Israeli military. In that one territorial unit, there are more than one legal systems, and which legal system applies to you is based on race, ethnicity, language, religion, all those categories in the covenant. That's the definition of apartheid. In Israel, if you're in, say, the West Bank, and you're a 12-year-old kid, and you throw stones, there could be two 12-year-old kids that both throw stones at the same place, at the same time, in the West Bank. They would be treated completely differently. The Israeli kid would be treated the way we claim our juvenile justice system in the United States is supposed to work. It sometimes does, more often with white kids than with black kids, but it sometimes works the right way. And what that means is the process is designed for the benefit of the child. The child can never be questioned without parents and a lawyer being present. The child is never put in dangerous situations, is never imprisoned with adults. There's all these protections of the child. The Israeli child will be taken into a system exactly like that, as they should, because that is how every child
Should be treated. Yeah.
The Palestinian child, in most cases, will not be arrested at that moment. They will the soldiers will come, not police, soldiers will come to their house at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's their general way, because it magnifies the fear. They want them to be afraid. The child will be taken from the parents. The parents will not be told where the child is being taken. Very reminiscent of what happens on our borders these days.
And in apartheid South
taken-
Africa.
taken in violation of international law out of the West Bank into Israel proper, interrogated without parents or lawyer being present by a military interrogator, brought to a military juvenile court. Israel is the only country in the world that has a military detention system for juveniles. It's the only place in the world. And that is what would happen to two different 12-year-old kids who each throw a stone, who each, whatever, do something bad, right? As 12-year-olds do. But you see the difference. And the difference is one is a Jewish Israeli settler, the other is a Palestinian child. And that's what determines, that's the only thing that determines which legal system they get pulled into. That's the definition of apartheid.
Okay, so we're at the end of the interview, and I think it's a very powerful anecdote or example to end on. I would like to say thank you very much for being here, for always sharing your knowledge, and for always being so outspoken on the side of the truth.
Thank you very much.
It certainly gives us a lot of hope. When we sit sometimes in very dire times and we feel despondent, it's a breath of fresh air to listen to somebody like you.
We all have a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Phyllis. With that, fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء.
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار.